Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're talking about the 1830s, a time when the American fight against slavery just exploded, going from a pretty quiet debate to a full-blown radical crusade. So, we're going to dive into how this movement lit the fire that would eventually lead to the Civil War.
You see, for a long time, anti-slavery efforts were all about slow, gradual change. But then, in the 1830s, something just snapped. We really need to understand why. What was it that transformed this movement from being patient to being radical almost overnight?
And this was the crucial shift. It was fueled by the religious intensity of the Second Great Awakening. Abolitionists stopped arguing that slavery was just, bad for the country. They started condemning it as a profound sin. And their demand was absolute freedom, now, with no compensation for slaveholders. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a moral ultimatum.
So, where did this all start? Well, it began within the free black community, with these early strategies of peaceful progress. But the violent backlash they faced proved that a different, much more confrontational path was going to be necessary.
Okay, so in the early decades, leaders like James Forten and Prince Hall pushed this strategy of social uplift. The thinking was pretty logical, right? If free black people could prove themselves to be educated, hardworking, and respectable, well then the whole racist logic behind slavery would just fall apart. They built their own institutions, churches, schools, and in 1827, even the first African-American newspaper.
But this quest for equality ran into a brutal reality. See, that deep-seated racism wasn't just a Southern problem. Not at all. I mean, listen to this quote from a white maid in the North. That contempt was everywhere. White mobs terrorized black communities in northern cities, burning down homes and churches, sending a terrifyingly clear message that respectability was not going to protect them.
So what happens when that peaceful approach is met with fire and violence? Well, the calls for a more confrontational approach get a whole lot louder and a whole lot more desperate. And this right here, this is the voice of that new radicalism. David Walker, a free black man in Boston, published this pamphlet that was just incendiary. It spread like wildfire. He didn't just condemn slavery, he used the language of the Bible to justify slave rebellion, warning white America that its destruction was coming unless it changed its ways. This was a revolutionary call to arms.
And then just 2 years later, it felt like Walker's apocalyptic prophecy had come true. Nat Turner, a deeply religious enslaved man, believed he had a vision from God. He led a revolt that sent an absolute shockwave of terror across the entire South, proving that this fight could turn very, very violent.
So all of a sudden, you have two forms of radicalism exploding onto the scene, Walker's intellectual rebellion and Turner's violent uprising. They were different, for sure, but they both shattered any illusion that this could be resolved peacefully. And in response, the South didn't reform, it clamped down with even more brutal slave codes. It was into this supercharged, tense atmosphere that a new group of deeply religious white abolitionists stepped up, and they were determined to organize all this moral outrage into a national crusade.
At the forefront of this was William Lloyd Garrison. Through his newspaper, The Liberator, he became the unapologetic voice of the movement. He was influenced by British abolitionists, and he rejected any and all compromise. No gradual plans, no sending people back to Africa. Just immediate, unconditional, uncompensated emancipation. His words were basically a declaration of war on the institution of slavery.
Now, this wasn't just about shouting on street corners. These folks were organized. With backing from wealthy merchants, the abolitionists launched this really sophisticated three-pronged attack, combining mass media, direct action, and political lobbying into a coordinated assault.
And their media campaign was incredibly effective. This number, 100,000, that's how many copies of a single book, American Slavery as It Is, sold in just 1 year. It was filled with first-hand testimony and stories clipped right from Southern newspapers, detailing the torture and brutality of slavery, making the horror of it all impossible to deny.
Their direct aid, well, that was a profound act of civil disobedience. The Underground Railroad was this network of incredibly brave individuals like Harriet Tubman, who risked their own lives and freedom to guide about 1,000 enslaved people to the North every single year. Each person who escaped was a direct blow, both financial and symbolic, to the slave system.
And on the political front, they were just relentless. This number, nearly 500,000, that's how many signatures were on the anti-slavery petitions they sent to Congress by 1838.
They were demanding an end to the slave trade in D.C. and a ban on new slave states, forcing the federal government to confront an issue it desperately wanted to ignore.
But, you can't launch an attack on a nation's most profitable institution without provoking a furious response. The abolitionists' crusade was met with a widespread and violent backlash from all corners of the country. It's really important to remember, the abolitionists were a radical, unpopular minority, and they were opposed by a powerful coalition. This wasn't just Southern slaveholders. We're talking Northern merchants whose fortunes were tied to cotton, workers who were afraid of job competition, conservatives horrified that women were speaking in public, and countless white Americans terrified of racial mixing.
And this is where you see the opposition become institutionalized. It started with Southern postmasters illegally destroying abolitionist mail. Then, Congress itself passed a gag rule to silence any debate. And finally, it escalated to murder, when a mob killed an editor named Elijah Lovejoy just for daring to print anti-slavery views. The system was fighting back, and fighting back hard.
The pressure was absolutely immense. And as the movement was being attacked from the outside, it also began to crack from within, splintering over big questions of strategy and principle.
The breaking point came in 1840. William Lloyd Garrison wanted to broaden the movement to include women's rights and other reforms. But for many others, that was just too much. They wanted a laser focus on slavery and a more traditional political approach. So the movement fractured into two factions, each with a totally different vision for how to move forward.
So let's recap. They were a small minority, they were hated, they were attacked by mobs and suppressed by the government, and they were split among themselves. By all accounts, they should have failed, and yet their impact was profound and irreversible.
Because here's their ultimate achievement, and it was undeniable. Through their relentless agitation, they dragged the moral crisis of slavery out of the shadows and placed it squarely at the center of American life. After the abolitionists, the nation could no longer look away.
And this leaves us with this amazing paradox. How could such a small, fractured, and despised group of radicals push a nation to the brink of its own destruction? Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most radical ideas are the only ones that can change everything.